Okay, I think we will begin. My name is Tom Nixon and I teach here at the Courtauld, and I'm pleased to welcome you to this, our second Medieval Work in Progress seminar of this semester. In a moment I'm going to introduce our speaker, but I just wanted to alert you to a forthcoming event that might be of interest, which is on the 8th of March, when we have the third seminar in this series, when Dr. Nicholas Flory will be talking about the Cartuja de Miraflores in Spain. So do look out for that, and you can book on the website, the 8th of March, that is. In the meantime, and he'll be talking about very lovely alabaster as well, I imagine, which segues quite awkwardly, or not very subtly, to our, introducing our speaker to tonight, Dr. Marianne de Bain, who is curator of Old Masters, or head of Old Masters at the M Museum in Leuven. She's published on aspects of sculpture and painting in and around the year 1500, and has curated and been responsible for a number of exhibitions at the museum in Leuven, but particularly tonight she's going to talk about this exhibition on alabaster that's been in Leuven since October. There's still time, I think a couple of weeks, to go and see it. I'm going to see it next week. I'm very excited, and we're really grateful for coming to speak about this wonderful exhibition. So we will have the talk. There'll be some time for questions at the end of that. Then I hope that anyone who's available will come and join us upstairs in the research forum, where we will have some drinks and further informal discussions. But for now, Richard, thank you.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you for having me here. I won't be talking about an object or an artist, but about a material, and not about the material as such, but about the exhibition on the material. I am a curator of Old Masters, as Tom has said, at M Leuven, and we have mounted this show on alabaster together with the Louvre in Paris. They are our partner for this exhibition. I have curated this exhibition together with Sophie Jugy, who is the curator of sculpture, medieval and Renaissance sculpture at the Louvre. And that is not a coincidence that we are working together, because a few years ago, we were together at a conference talking about our love for alabaster, as you do at conferences on medieval sculpture. Talk about love for sculpture. And she said, well, we have all this research that I've been sitting on for a few years already, and I want to do an exhibition. But I don't have any room at the Louvre, because we have to take numbers as curators and have to then prepare for 5 to 10 years until it's our turn to be able to mount our exhibition. And it so happens that at Leuven we want to do exhibitions on sculpture every 2 to 3 years, and I personally wanted to do one on alabaster already for a long time. So it was obvious that we had to work together. And that's what we did. We started to talk about this exhibition. I'm just going to do this a little bit, because it's difficult to look into. We decided to do this exhibition together, combine their research with our, and you will see that on the pictures that I will show, with our big exhibition rooms, which has proven to be very successful for exhibitions on sculpture, who need, in my opinion, room. Objects need to be looked at in 3D. They are three-dimensional objects. You need to be able to give them some room, and that's what we have. We have room. For those of you who have been to Leuven, you know what I'm talking about. The exhibition, before I dive into it, I will show you a lot of images in hopes that you will be keen to come and visit Belgium in February. The exhibition is thematic, so that means that we are not focusing on artists, on objects, on periods even. The exhibition is thematic in that aspect that we take the alabaster as focal point, and then we move from the late Middle Ages, from the 14th century until the Baroque period, mid of the 17th century, throughout all the rooms. So we have this multi-period and multi-geography going on, because we are showing objects from all over Western Europe. We go from England to Spain, to Germany, to Italy, to France, to the Low Countries, and everything in between. We shed light in the first room on the material as such and sculpting in alabaster. And it's now a good time to go to the rooms where the objects are being shown. It is a first introductory gallery, although we show a lot of objects already. And we look in this gallery to how alabaster was quarried and sculpted, and we place it into a wider context, culturally, historically, the distribution of the production, and also this recent scientific research that has been conducted on the material itself, which I will talk about in a minute. It's a large space, and it focuses on these characteristics of this material in its sculpting capacity, the way the hardness or the softness, I must say, of the alabaster helps in sculpting this material, the way color variations, depending on which quarry the stone has been quarried at, influence the object that you're looking at, the tools and techniques that have been used, the surface treatments in terms of polychromy or the non-existence of polychromy in some cases, the significance, the use of alabaster throughout the centuries. And you see, I hope you see that we do have a lot of objects in this first room. We show this with some, words, like a word cloud of things that all have to do with these characteristics of the stone, such as translucency, quarry, even the scientific code or the chemical code of the stone, which is actually a calcium sulfate hydrate stone. I'm not a chemist. That's all I know about it. But the hydrate part is interesting because it means that alabaster is very fragile and can be dissolved in water, because that's very interesting to know. Alabaster has been used mostly for indoor sculpture, as outdoors it would not withstand weather circumstances. I will show you some objects that we have. These two wonderful Annunciation medallions are kind of the resume of the exhibition, but they are at the beginning announcing to you this exhibition in all their virtuosity, in all their small scale as well. They are not so big, they are 30 to 40 centimeters wide, and they are really, really, really finely carved with a lot of detail, with a lot of room also. If you see, I don't know, oh yes, I do know, the scrolls, the scrolls where the words are painted on, they really are carved out of the stone. They seem to be floating, as they should be in the iconography as well. A combination of partial polychromy also in these objects, with just a little bit of polychromy on the faces, carnal tones, and then gild in the hair, the wings of the angel, and also on the borders of their clothing. We don't know where these come from. It's very hard to localize these in terms of style. It has been said Burgundian Netherlands, it has been said France, but they are now at the Schnutchen Museum in Cologne. No, they're not there at Leuven. Sorry, they will return to Cologne anyway. In this first room, we also try to give insight into the difference between alabaster and marble, because that has been from early on in the Middle Ages already a point of confusion. Alabaster has been confused with marble over and over again during the course of history. In that sense, even that in accounts, for instance, clerks would note that the sculpture was made or was commissioned in marble, and then it happened to be alabaster when research was conducted on it, and vice versa. So the use of the term was not clear. What is alabaster? And it has been, even up till now, as I will show a little bit later on, the confusion remains. But here we put, and in the exhibition room that's the same, we put two objects together, two sculptures from Conrad Meit. Conrad Meit is an early 16th century sculptor who worked at the court of Margaret of Austria in Mechelen. He came from Metz, I believe it was. But then he settled in Mechelen to work for Margaret of Austria. She has had a big wharf around the 1530s in Brou, Bourg-en-Bresse in Brou, in French southern Burgundy area, where she had her mausoleum church erected for her and her deceased husband, where their funerary monuments are today still to be seen. And Conrad Meit, he made the effigies for these funerary monuments in marble, but he also worked in alabaster, as these objects show. The left one, yes, the left-hand one is in alabaster. It is from Saint-Amand-les-Eaux in the northern of France. And the right one is from the cathedral in Brussels, and she's in marble. So that's interesting to combine and to compare these two objects as well, as they show, well, very similar poses in terms of composition. It's the same iconography where the Virgin and Child are, well, leaning towards each other, having this physical, intimate connection between each other. They are, well, worked out a little bit differently. The Virgin in the alabaster version on the left holds the Child with her both hands. In the right one, it's just one hand, as she is holding her wonderfully carved book in the left hand. But both sculptures have been conceived as kind of a bust. The drapery has been folded really under the sculpture, which means it was really conceived as such. It is a type of composition that comes from Italy. Conrad Meit was very focused on what was happening in Italy. He was one of the first sculptors to bring the Italian Renaissance, or the new ideas in that sense, to the Low Countries. So it is not surprisingly that this composition has this link with Italian sculpture as well. It is really interesting to see them together in the exhibition, as you can really make out the differences between alabaster and marble, the way the alabaster sculpture also wears or has worn differently throughout the years, as alabaster does react differently to heat, to water, to dirt even. So that's really interesting to have them together. We have some other in the room, some other comparisons, which I'm not showing in the PowerPoint, but comparisons, for instance, between alabaster and boxwood, as there are, of course, sculptors who combine sculpting in stone or in alabaster with sculpting in wood. And the interesting thing is the alabaster is so soft in terms of its hardness, much softer than marble, that they can actually use the same tools for wood carving in alabaster carving. So it's almost like cutting in alabaster, as Kim Woods so eloquently put in the title of her alabaster book. I'm just going to have a sip while you enjoy these two wonderful pieces by Riemenschneider. We know Tilman Riemenschneider as one of the most famous German sculptors from the late Gothic era, and mostly for his limewood sculpture. It is lesser known that he sculpted sometimes in alabaster as well. He came from the Würzburg area, he worked and lived there, and there was alabaster there in the ground. There were alabaster quarries, so it's not that difficult to envisioned that he would use alabaster from time to time as a material, maybe as a commission rather than his own choice, but he had access to the material. And these are two, well, not so large objects in terms of dimensions. They are something like this, so not that big. And the left one is a Virgin from the Annunciation, which is now at the Musée du Louvre. And the right one is now at Cleveland Museum of Art. They both stem from the same Church of St. Peter in Erfurt. It's not said that they were from the same ensemble because, well, the Annunciation and Jerome are not really iconographical themes that you would put together. But it is very interesting to have these two alabasters from the same church together again in Leuven. They are really very nicely carved in terms of detail. If you look at the hand also of the Virgin, the little door of the cabinet on her lectern, where if you look at it up close, you can even see the objects inside of the cabinet. They are really, really interesting details to look at. And here you also see this partial polychromy, partial gilding in the hairs, in the borders of her clothing, on the metal of the cabinet as well. There are also remains of little blue fragments, I would say, in terms of pigments in her eyes and red on the lips. So that's something we see sometimes, that also if there is no facial polychromy, then there are some color accents in the eyes, in the lips, sometimes in the nose as well. So the detail of this very delicately way the Saint Jerome is pulling out the thorn from the paw of the lion, it's really something of sheer beauty. This is something interesting. We have early on in the concept of this exhibition, this is one of the masterpieces of the Flemish community. It's a sculpture by André Beauneveu from the late 14th century, from the Funerary chapel of Louis de Mao, Count of Flanders, so it has this extraordinary provenance. But it has always been a mystery whether she was in alabaster or marble, and we put her in the exhibition as kind of an example of this doubt. But then the Royal Institute for Art Heritage in Brussels, they were going to clean it for the exhibition, and they said, well, let's do an analysis because we're working on a project to try to determine alabaster from marble. And then we were thinking, yes, let's know for sure. So at the time when the exhibition opened, she was determined as alabaster. And you feel where I'm going with this? This week a press release was released that in fact the conclusion from the analysis was not correct. And in fact, she is marble. Which is interesting because, well, when she was determined as an alabaster, everybody was like, wow, such a big block. That's hard to imagine. Where would she come from? Is it English alabaster? Is it French? Is it Spanish? So all these questions arose because people could not make sense of it, that it was alabaster. So for the first 3 months of the exhibition, she was really kind of the exception to the rule that we see, well, not really a rule, but that alabaster is mostly in smaller dimensions. But now she's determined that she is marble, which for me is actually no problem. People would think, well, oh no, a problem in your exhibition. For me, this is really a good thing because it helps us not only for this sculpture to answer new questions regarding the use of marble by Beauneveu, because it is Carrara marble, and Beauneveu is a northern French artist, so you can think of all the ways how he would get this Carrara marble in the 14th century. So a lot of new questions arise, and it's actually very exciting to dive into that. But also in terms of, well, the pure practicality of sculpting this image, it now all makes sense in a way that she is marble, because when you look at the object and the way she has been sculpted, she always had this marble feel to her, and the doubt was real. Now the doubt has been erased for good, because now they are really, really, really short. And we are also putting it like that in the exhibition, that new analysis has been conducted, which has, well, overthrown the former results. There are, however, 2 alabaster pieces in the sculpture, so she's still a little bit alabaster, and that's the crown and the wheel, as they are 19th century restorations. So they restored her with Spanish alabaster. The crown was originally also carved in marble, because it has been broken off. We see the damages on the head when you take off the alabaster crown, and the wheel, the same thing. Her sword is in brass. Very interesting development, which we can talk about more with people of the scientific committee later. But, well, I think it's wonderful, actually, that she keeps astonishing people, not only with her beauty, but also with her material. You see also some Spanish examples in the first room, the 4 half-naked men, I would say, and the way they have been, well, they have or have not been polychromed, because that's the interesting part here. Spanish alabaster tends to be polychromed quite heavily, and almost never in the almost always, sorry, in the skin tones, which is funny, because alabaster has been praised for its skin-like qualities in the past, and has been used for that as well, especially when you look at funerary sculpture. We will go to that in a next room. But the Spanish, they kind of turned it around. They used more the material like they would use wood, and they used their polychromy schemes like they would polychrome a wooden statue. They paint the faces, they give the decorations on the alabaster in, well, clothing or drapery, but it is often quite heavily polychromed. I must say the second statue, it's not an original polychromy, it's quite a later paint layer, but it follows the original polychromy, which was also quite heavily on this object. A wonderful Saint Humphrey, I think it is in English, Humphrey by Damien Forment, one of the most important Spanish sculptors. And the Humphrey next to him, the smaller version, I'll just go so that you see what I'm talking about. So this is the first Humphrey, this is the second one. There, now you see no polychromy anymore, but they have found remnants of gilding in the hair, so you must imagine him as unpolychromed in the skin tones. His body was not polychromed. It is quite a pinkish alabaster that has been used, and his hair was almost completely, his long beard, almost completely gilded. So that must have been quite an interesting sight to see. In our second room, we go into this research project that the Louvre has conducted, and actually it is quite interesting to talk about this because they have worked together with a French institute called BRGM. It stands for something, but I can't remember. But it is a scientific institute that does isotope analysis, so chemical analysis of the stone. They take samples and then they try to analyze the elements in the stone, and most specifically the sulfur, the strontium, and the oxygen in the stone. And by analyzing the isotopes, which are the elements, or that's not the right word, the pieces of the molecule that can be localized, they can actually localize the stone to a quarry. So they can really put a name to the stone. They can find out where the stone came from. And I think you understand that this is quite interesting for art historians in terms of finding economical relations between production centers and quarries, finding trade routes, understanding where materials come from, which objects have been made in what are the relations between a sculptor and a quarry, things like that. So you see on this slide actually a map of some of them. I don't know if you see it all the way to the back, a map of some of the most frequently used quarries in Europe. You see in the East Midlands region here in England, the Harz region in Germany, Franconia, the Jura region and the Alps, also in the Provence region, Spain, the region around the river Ebro, and also in Tuscany, the Volterra region. Those are the most frequently used alabaster quarries for sculpture. There are more quarries, but these are the ones that pop up all the time in the analysis of the BRGM. That way we can, on the labels, put localization, production, well, not a production center, but a place where the alabaster stems from. And I'm just going to go back one slide because it is interesting. We have a showcase where these three objects are shown together, which at first sight would have nothing to do with each other, and that is actually true, but they are all have been part of this research program, and that's why we put them together in this room. St. Augustine from the Royal Monastery in Brou, which I talked about, the Mausoleum Monastery for Margaret of Austria. He was actually the starting point of the research project because for a long time he had no head. His head was broken off and he was kept in Brou as a headless standing male figure. They had the heart, so they knew it was an Augustine statue, but the head was missing. It turns out that the Louvre had a head without a body. So they were always thinking, well, they might have something to do with each other, but in terms of style and in terms of dimension, it doesn't seem to add up because it is quite a small head for a quite, a largely worked out sculpture. It is quite wide. It has this manneristic feel to the body. So they decided to put them together to see for sure, and it worked. The puzzle fit. The head fit brilliantly onto the surface where the head from the St. Augustine was broken off. So in this case, no further research was needed. They could just put the head on the object, and that was that. And now it has been fixed permanently on the saint's body, so the head remains. They call it a permanent loan. The head remains in Brou, of course. It would be a shame to take them apart again. But it made researchers like Sophie Jugy and also Lise Leroux from the RGM think about what when we don't have these easy answers, what when we keep having questions, when we put objects together and we cannot determine if they belong together or if they belong somewhere in a quarry at all. And that was the case with these two sculptures of the Annunciation on the right. They are French sculptures from the 14th century, second third of the 14th century, so some of the earliest objects in the exhibition. They have been separated for a long time already. One is kept in Cleveland again, and the other at the Louvre, and there was always this hunch that they were from the same ensemble, but it was difficult to determine, as you can agree with me, that the style in the 14th century is quite consistent throughout a large production area. So, well, you can have, by way of saying, 20 Annunciations that look like this, and they might and look like they belong together, 20 angels and 20 virgins. So they thought, well, let's do this isotope analysis to be sure, to know if they are made from the same alabaster. Then we know with more certainty to back up our stylistic hunch that they are belonging together. And in fact, they have the same analysis results. In that sense, even that they showed a quarry that nobody knew yet. It was a new quarry in Malocène, which is near Avignon. And they didn't know there was a quarry there. There is no longer a quarry there, so there were no samples yet investigated. So it gave way to a lot of new questions, because this is the Annunciation from Javernan. Javernan is more to the north of France. Why would a sculptor in Javernan use alabaster all the way from Avignon? That's not the cheapest solution. There are quarries much closer by. A first hypothesis is that there is a link between the bishop who ordered these sculptures and the papal court in Avignon. So it might make sense that he was at one point in Avignon and had his alabaster, or maybe even the Annunciation itself, shipped to Javernan. It has not been proven yet, but it is an interesting hypothesis nonetheless. That was the first room. We have 5 more to go. It's quite a big exhibition. We have 130 pieces in the exhibition, all alabaster sculptures and some other objects to support our story. And like I said, we move in themes. So the first room is what is alabaster and how did we research it. And then we move on to the second room, which is the funerary sculpture room, which is, well, logical to have this as our first really elaborated theme, because funerary sculpture is kind of the beginning for the use of alabaster in Western Europe, in that sense that the way alabaster starts to be used from the 14th century onwards is mostly at the French and the English courts for funerary sculpture, and also for alabaster altarpieces, which I will talk about in the next room. But that's kind of the start for alabaster. At these courts, they start using alabaster instead of marble or metal, for instance, as they did before that period. Probably it has to do with the start of quarrying also, with the economical development of these quarries. And these courts decide that alabaster is a noble enough material to have their funerary monuments sculpted in. So the question I get a lot in the exhibition is if alabaster is the cheap equivalent to marble. But I think you can agree with me that if kings and courts order alabaster monuments, it had nothing to do with cheap. It had to do with the fact that it was a material that was thought to be noble enough to have their effigies made. Of course, these early effigies are very difficult to loan if they are still there. They are quite fixed in their churches. There are some lovely examples here in England, and there are a few 15th century examples also on the mainland, but we did not have those in our exhibition. We do have some of these wonderful mourners from the tomb monument of Jean-Duc de Berry, who is the brother of Philip the Bold, Duke of Burgundy. And you may know the wonderful funerary monuments in Dijon, who came from the Carthusian cloister in Chaumont, which was the mausoleum mausoleum cloister for the Dukes of Burgundy. And the pleurants, the mourners that are on this funerary monument for Philip the Bold, for instance, and John the Fearless. Well, Jean-Duc de Berry he wanted that as well. That's clear. He mirrored himself to his brother, to the Burgundian court, and he had his funerary monument, which was made for the Cathedral of Bourges. So a little bit more to the west, towards Paris. He had his monument also decorated with this funerary procession of mourners. And you can see here 6 mourners from the funerary monument of Jean-Duc de Berry. 4 of them come from the Louvre, and 2 of them are now in the Phoebus Foundation. They are not the only ones that are still kept. There are quite a few of these mourners from the Berry tomb circulating all over the globe. But we have these 6, and there is something funny or interesting going on in terms of materials, because this tomb monument has been made in 2 phases, one around 1400 and one around 1450. And the first phase, where the sculptor Jean de Cambrai was in charge, the pleurons, the mourners, are made in marble. And those are the 2 on the left. And then in the second phase, around 1450, the material of choice was alabaster, and all the remaining mourners that had to be made were made in alabaster. So you have this combination of the 2 materials in one monument, where you can feel like we're on a, how do you see it, a key moment in the use of alabaster for funerary sculpture. That both exist at the same time in this period. The color change, or the color differences between the 4, I would say the central 2 and the 2 on the right, they are both the same, or all 4 the same alabaster, but they have to do with different ways of cleaning in the past. So it's more a color difference due to their material history rather than due to the fact that it would be different alabaster. Some of my favorite objects in the exhibition. They are objects that have to do with the memento mori idea, the idea that everybody is equal in death. And this wonderful, he's repelling, but he's wonderful, this wonderful skeleton on the left. It is an allegory of death, which is in the Louvre collection right now, but it comes from the cemetery of the Innocents, Cimetière des Innocents in Paris. Was made around 1530. It is made in alabaster. It looks quite brownish, but that has to do with the fact that there is a brown wash that has been put on the alabaster in the 18th century, but it is almost complete alabaster, except for a few restorations in lead. Very strange material for the restorations. For instance, the arm that goes up until here, this part is in lead. But nonetheless, the major part of the sculpture is in alabaster, and it is simply in all its morbidity, in all its ugliness, and the way this skeleton has this kind of grin to his face, and on his, how do you call it? Plaque that he has with him, where the inscription says that everybody is equal in death. It is quite an interesting sculpture, the way the flesh hangs from the skeleton as well. He is in a half state of decay. He's welcoming the visitor to the room. He's the first thing people see in the room. Actually, before the mourners, you see this. So he really sets the tone for this funerary sculpture gallery. Of course, he was on the cemetery there in Paris, but he was covered because otherwise he would not look like he does today. The rain would have washed a lot of the alabaster away. He was covered under a little canopy. The cemetery does not exist anymore, and since then the object is in the Louvre. On the right, you see an interesting transy sculpture. A transy, for those who do not know, but I think most of you might know, is a form of effigy where you do not see the deceased person lying in his full ornate, in his official clothing or harness, but shows more of a fragile state of the deceased, and in this case he seems to be floating between life and death almost. It's like he's breathing out his last breath, and the detail from his face might give you this suggestion as well, where he seems to be almost just has let out his last breath or is in the process of doing so, lying naked or half naked under a piece of cloth on a simple mat, so nothing to do with these, well, I would say almost glamorous way of depicting the deceased in the effigies that we often see. Often this was combined in sort of a double-decker funerary monument where you had the top layer where the effigy as such was placed, and then the transy was placed often on the bottom in a second level. Sometimes it's turned around as well. But I'm not the specialist on this, Jessica Barker here at the Courtauld is. This is a transy from a monument from Hainaut, from Belgium, in the little town of Boussu, where there is a chapel that most people miss when they go to Hainaut. They mostly go to Mons, but there's this little village called Boussu where the chapel of the Lords, Seigneur, Chapelle des Seigneurs, is, which contains a lot of marvelous funerary monuments from the Hénin-Liétard family, who were the counts of Boussu. So that's a travel tip for you. We have also this wonderful kneeling effigy from Pedro I of Castile, his royalty, the only royalty we have in the exhibition. He was the King of Spain, and this is his funerary effigy, which is now kept in the Archaeological Museum in Madrid. It is the first known kneeling effigy of Spain, so makes it very special as well. In Spain, alabaster is everywhere. So to say, there is a lot of alabaster, and it was also for funerary monuments a very preferred material, also for lying effigies, but as well for these kneeling effigies that start to happen around the 15th century. The deceased are often depicted in a kneeling position towards the altar, kneeling towards God. This is a very interesting sculpture because it has a lot of detail on it. It's not easy to see on a picture, but the textures of the different fabrics and the leather, the metal of his clothing, his harness is really interesting to see how the sculptor, who is anonymous, a Castilian sculptor, how he has worked with this alabaster to make these different textures visible. There is an interesting thing going on with his head. It looks a bit stained. It looks less worked out as the rest of the body or the rest of the effigy, and that's true. It has been less carved out, and that is because it was meant, and it has been fully painted, polychromed, like often these Spanish monuments and sculptures are. It has been fully painted, so probably the sculptor did not put all that work into a face that would be painted over quite heavily in terms of detail. So that's why his face looks a bit odd next to the rest of his body. We have one full effigy monument in the exhibition that is at the Louvre. This is not royalty. not nobility. This is a man of the army. It's Admiral Philippe Chabot, who was a man of the sea, and that's something that you see in his effigy all over, because there's a lot of symbols, a lot of details that refer to his life at sea, his life on a ship. There are links to fish on his tunic. There is knots from I don't know, naval knots. Is that what you call it? On his chain there is shells, and also there was quite an elaborate architectural decoration surrounding his effigy. Of course, this is just what remains from his tomb monument, which was in the Celestine Church of Paris. But the church has been broken down. But there is a drawing also in the exhibition, but I show it here, from around 1700, which is kept in the National Library in Paris, which shows you more details of this architectural decoration surrounding the effigy, and you can see even the anchors in the corners, corner decoration there, everything linking him to the sea, the fish on the sarcophagus also. Very interesting monument. That is, well, quite large actually, and also the effigy is a full block of alabaster, so that is quite remarkable and one of the biggest pieces in the exhibition. After the funerary sculpture, which has more than what I showed you, a few smaller pieces as well, we move on to the altarpieces, and the reliefs, and that's something that most people often know when you talk about alabaster. That is these alabaster reliefs, and that's mostly to do with the fact that English reliefs and also Low Country Malines alabasters were immensely popular, but they only show a fragment of what was the whole story regarding alabaster altarpieces, and we tried to give the whole story in this room, which is divided into the 14th and 15th century on one hand, and then the 16th and the 17th century in a second part of the room. The first alabaster altarpieces also start to rise in this courtly context, and one of the earliest examples, or some of the earliest examples, are these alabaster reliefs showing scenes from the Passion, which we show here in the room. There are two reliefs kept now in the Museum Meijer van den Berg in Antwerp, and two come from the Louvre. And it is said that they are from the same workshop. Somebody even stated it might be the same altarpiece, but I'm not keen to follow that, because for me the fragments are just a little bit too different in terms of size and way they have been worked out. But I think it's clear these alabaster reliefs, these early alabaster altarpieces, which we know were mounted often, the alabaster reliefs, on black marble. So here you actually have an idea of how it would look with the black scenography as well. They were closely linked also to ivory sculpture in Paris at that time, and I think if you visit the exhibition you will see the likeness in terms of carving quality. So maybe these ivory sculptors sometimes worked in alabaster as well, or looked at each other in terms of style and composition. And then a little bit later on, in the 15th century, I'm not here to teach you about English alabasters. I think you can manage on your own. A lot of specialists in the room here tonight. But we cannot not talk about English alabasters in an exhibition on alabaster, because they have been made so often. They were so immensely popular for a big market, not only in England, but also on the mainland. And in fact, if you take that into account, we don't show a lot of English alabaster in the exhibition, but we show some very fine examples. One relief here from the V&A and one a seat of mercy from the Museum of Fine Arts in Ghent that are really nice examples of this. There are some more in the exhibition as well. Especially for the Belgian audience anyway, it was interesting, well, it was kind of a surprise to know that these reliefs came from altarpieces, because that's something often people forget. They pop up on the art market every now and then, but as single altarpiece fragments, and actually the whole setting of such an altarpiece is not so known. There are not so many altarpieces that still remain, and you have here a very beautiful example at the V&A, the Swansea altarpiece, and also in Naples there is a really fine example of an original English altarpiece. In the exhibition we have this, which is the closest, the next best thing, because these two that I just mentioned cannot travel. This is an altarpiece that was on the art market quite recently, is now in the Phoebus Foundation in Antwerp, and it shows really well how these altarpiece fragments, how these reliefs would have functioned in an ensemble. And this is a martyrdom altarpiece with 4 scenes of martyrs, 2 martyrs on the left and the right, 2 standing saints, and then in the middle you have a seat of mercy with angels as a central panel. I do have to say that the case for this particular altarpiece is not original, but it has been well made to the example of remaining altarpiece cases. This is late 19th, early 20th century, how do you say it, new altarpiece case. We also have the so-called Master of Rimini, who is in the 15th century alabaster production, quite an enigmatic figure or workshop, as nobody really knows who he is, where he comes from, but we do know what was made in the workshop, and we have some really nice examples of objects by the Master of Rimini, such as the large Pieta on the left-hand side from the Louvre, but also some objects. The Pieta, of course, probably wasn't part of an altarpiece, but we put her here in this room in the Rimini display. The most important or the most known object that gave name to the Master of Rimini is actually the altarpiece of Rimini, which was formerly kept at the Santa Maria della Grazie church in Rimini in Italy, but is now at the Liebig house in Frankfurt. And that's actually the altarpiece that gave the name to the master. The Master of Rimini has nothing to do with Rimini in the sense that he does not come from there, did not work in Rimini. But the altarpiece was there. A lot of research has gone into this altarpiece. An exhibition has been shown, I think last year, in the Liebig house in Frankfurt, because the more we research this artist or workshop, the more questions pop up. In terms of style, it is for most researchers clear that this workshop was to be located somewhere in the southern Netherlands, maybe Bruges. But isotope analysis has shown recently that the alabaster used is German alabaster, which is quite interesting. You would imagine in Bruges that they would use English alabaster. However, in the 1430s, the Burgundian Netherlands and the English did not get along really well. They were at war, so maybe there was how do you say it? No more export of English alabaster in that period, which made the workshop refer to German quarries. Could be, we don't know. It remains very unclear. We do know that this style has been very influential, and before apostles in the right bottom corner. They are from Saint-Omer, from the Musée Saint-Delin. They are really marvelous, but they are influenced by this Rimini style. They have the same poses, they have roughly similar facial features, hair features, in terms of drapery and folding. It all looks very much like the Rimini pieces, but they clearly are made by another hand. So this is something to take into account, that at that point this style was also quite widespread. In the second part of this room we move to the 16th and 17th centuries. Actually it's a whole new gallery, because you enter a whole new era. You go from the Middle Ages to the Renaissance in a few footsteps. And one of the most interesting pieces I want to show you here is an altarpiece which is now in a private collection, which is from the circle of Jean Mone. Jean Mone was a court sculptor for Charles V, for the emperor, and he was one of these first artists, just like Conrad Meit, for instance, who brought the Renaissance language of form to the Low Countries. And I think you see well how he adapts these Renaissance decoration elements, such as these columns, which are actually said to be Mone columns, because it's a very distinctive way of forming these columns, where he kind of reinvents the Netherlandish altarpiece. We come from a period in the 15th century. Netherlandish altarpieces were extremely popular, have been exported from Brussels and Antwerp until the 1520s, 1530s were the high days of this production. But they are mostly altarpieces in wood, polychromed wood. And here you see kind of a development going from these wooden altarpieces to alabaster altarpieces, where you still have a wooden case, but you have these alabaster scenes, alabaster reliefs that are being put in a wooden case with a lot of Renaissance elements to it. A very interesting piece that has not been researched that much yet, as it is going from private collection to private collection. But well, I invite all researchers to come and look at it while it is on view in Leuven. We also have these kind of house altars, we call them, from Mechelen in the exhibition. Jean Mone was one of the artists who also made that quite popular. You see also here again these Mone columns with the, I don't know the exact term, but with the straight part on top and then kind of a decorated part at the bottom. These house altars, Mechelen house altars, are very similar in terms of form. They always have this wooden Renaissance-like frame, and often three alabaster or more alabaster elements with a frieze on top, a frieze at the bottom, and then a central scene. Sometimes they are, how do you say it? I would say coronated, but that's Flemish word, with more elaborate decoration on the top. On the right you see not a Low Countries piece, but a Spanish piece, and that's quite interesting because Damien Forment, who is one of the leading artists bringing in new Renaissance ideas from Italy to Spain, paving the way for a new formal language in Spanish sculpture. This piece kind of has that already in itself, because the scene, the adoration of the Magi, is very Italian in terms of style, but he places it in a Mechelen-like house altar case. So he kind of adopts a lot of European elements, things we know he traveled, he went to Italy, he went to the Low Countries, he adopts all these elements and makes them his own in this wonderful house altar, I would say, from Huesca. If you turn around in this room, because first you look at these pieces, then you turn around, you see this, you see these, we try to anyway, show a mass of, it's not that many, but a mass of Mechelen alabasters, as they were immensely popular in the 17th century. And we show also, on the right, you see in that room, a very interesting relief, which I want to talk to you about a little bit more. A relief from France made for a church in Paris by Jean Just. That's the French name. He's actually called Giovanni di Giusto di Betti. So he's an Italian sculptor who came to France and brought with him his Renaissance formal language again. It's an immense piece. It's almost 2.5 meters wide. It weighs 650 kilos. It's just a terrible piece for our art handlers, but they managed anyway to put it on the wall because it hangs, and that's quite extraordinary. It is an altarpiece that was meant to function behind an altar, and it shows the death of Mary with the 12 apostles. And what is very striking is that you have here this combination between very high relief, almost sculpted in the round, in the foreground. All these, in the galleries you see that much better. They almost step out of the alabaster. They are almost completely loose from the block. And then you have kind of a perspective going inside the relief, where you go from a very high relief to kind of a semi-relief, quite literally. They are only carved out in half. The figures are only half there. Into, and I hope you see it on the image, into what for me feels like engraving in alabaster. It's such a low relief. It's almost no relief at all, no height difference. It's almost, well, drawing or engraving on the alabaster. You have this landscape that unfolds from the architecture in the left, and then you go into kind of a view of a seascape with boats, ships sailing away, mountains in the back, and then it evolves into a landscape on the right with, well, some more buildings, some details of people riding on horses, little animals, a hunter that is walking on the hill with his little dog. It's just full of detail, and it's immensely interesting just because of the fact that there is no relief anymore. It's almost as if you step into the alabaster block, into some kind of new dimension. What is also interesting is the assumption of the Virgin, because, well, the Virgin is on her deathbed, and often this is combined with an Assumption scene. And you see the Virgin being brought to heaven by the angels, and she does not look like a virgin as you would think in normal scenes. She is, it's a naked, half-naked woman. She does have her hands folded, but this is almost like a Venus of Botticelli. It's really extremely interesting to see how this scene even gets a kind of a Renaissance makeover by Jean Just. A really interesting relief altogether. On the big wall where we show this mass of Mechelen pieces, I want to highlight two of them to you here, Mechelen or Antwerp. We have this very interesting allegory of the triumph of Christ, which is, in terms of iconography, very special. It combines a lot of elements together. It is said to be from the circle of Cornelis Floris or Robert de Nol. It's not really sure, so we prefer to call it Antwerp, from the late 16th century, and you feel the 17th century around the corner. You feel the Baroque style already in this relief. It's really on the between the mid 16th century Renaissance style and Baroque waiting to happen, I would say. On the right side, you have something that is, well, known but not often shown together. That is how these Mechelen reliefs often adopt their composition from prints, and we have combined a few reliefs with a few prints to show this. We have a relief which shows auditus, which means hearing, so it's a relief series of the five senses. We show a few, we show 3 in the exhibition, which have been made after engravings by Cornelis Kort, who made his engravings after paintings by Frans Floris in 1561, so we know that would be a date to put the Malines reliefs after. They probably originated after 1561 because of that. What is interesting here is you see the composition is turned around, it is mirrored. We don't know what was mirrored, was it the engraving or the alabaster, but they are mirrors of them, of each other, where you have the female figure playing music and accompanied by instruments, and a deer on the left and right for the print.
Now, yeah, I
Yes.
don't want to rush you, but we should probably finish in the next 5 to 10 minutes. That's
Oh, we
okay.
do?
Yes.
Oh,
Sorry.
that's not good. Okay, so I only have 30 slides left. No, I'm almost at the end of the exhibition, but I combined 2 presentations just in case. But I will skip those at the back. I'll just show you the 2 last rooms. The penultimate room is called For Princes and Collectors, where we kind of established a Kunstkammer, a collector's cabinet of alabaster, where we show objects that have more a private connection, in that sense that they have been sometimes commissioned by private donors, or they have been very early on collected by private collectors. Sometimes they also have a kind of political, more worldly sense to them, and that's what you see mostly at the right-hand side with royal bust of Philippe II. I show you another image of this room. There are a lot of objects in this room, a lot of small objects, so this picture does not really do it right, but I do want to show you this. We have a wonderful Man of Sorrows, which is an interesting piece in terms of iconography. It combines 3 different iconographies, one of an Ecce Homo, a Man of Sorrows, and even a St. Gregory Mass together. But this picture also does not show this. For this, you really have to come to Leuven. The detail on this piece is extraordinary. It's really a piece of virtuoso carving. It's sculpted also completely in the round. You can walk around it. That's why we put it in a double-sided vitrine as well. What do we have also? We have this interesting double portrait of Charles II, Emperor Charles and Isabella of Portugal, which has more of a political meaning. It is to celebrate, of course, the very successful union in terms of love between Charles and Isabella, but also in terms of geographical combining of geographical regions to further make this empire of the Habsburgian dynasty. And then you have Philip II on the right, a bust in alabaster, completely in alabaster by Pompeo Leoni, son of Leoni, who was court sculptor of Philip II. Also quite political. A bust of a king is always with a political context, but also his His armor is full of iconography on power, warfare, things like that. In that cabinet, we also have this wonderful sleeping nymph by Paludanus or Willem van den Broeke. One of these objects that were probably made first and foremost for collecting, for private use, which had nothing to do with religious use, because often you have smaller religious statuettes of the Virgin with Child that are for private use, but do have their religious connotation. This is more worldly and even a little bit erotic in terms of connotation. Paludanus also looked very closely to Michelangelo, as you can see on this sculpture as well, which hints to the sculpture of the sleep of the Medici chapel. We have some heads of Saint John the Baptist, which are always interesting. We have a lecture by Sutkin van Houwaert in Leuven, who researched this topic in terms of why it was so popular in art in that period. Very interesting. And I do have to finish off, so I just want to show you our last room, which is kind of a celebration of our own masterpiece in alabaster. From our collection, it is the altarpiece of Saint Anne, which you see on the right, and it comes from the Celestine Church of Heverlee, which does not exist anymore. So it's that story that we tell in that room as kind of the last highlight of alabaster sculpture as well, because this altarpiece has been made in 1610. We have the whole provenance, we have the commission, there is a contract, there are documents, so it's really very nice to have all this information on a piece. And it is actually, well, one of the last highlights in alabaster, as from that moment onwards, painting became more preferable for commissioners to have altarpieces made, especially in the Low Countries anyway. We also have these wonderful sculptures also from this church, which we show. They are caryatids from the sacramental tower of the Celestine Church, which is always also interesting. It is also documented. We know who commissioned it. It was the woman here on the right. I'm just going really fast. She was a widow, the widow of William of Croailles. He was the son of Philippe of Croailles. We know his father better, I think, from images, the portrait painted by Rogier van der Weyden, and they both come, well, all these sculptures come from this cloister. They erected this cloister as kind of a mausoleum cloister, just like their forefathers, Margaret of Austria and the Dukes of Burgundy did. It was meant to be a mausoleum cloister for the Croailles family, and they had their own funerary monument, but also a lot of liturgical furniture, that's not the right word, a liturgical sculpture made, such as a sacramental tower and an alabaster altarpiece. I'm just going to skip a few things because the cloister is still partly to see in Leuven. This is the church where you see where these objects were, and H is the altarpiece of Saint Anne, and E is the sacramental tower. You can see on the map where they were. These are the documents. Interesting is that the sacramental tower was made probably by Cornelis Floris, and today I discovered that the V&A has a full cast of the sacramental tower of Zout-Leeuw in the cast court. I did not know that. I was in awe of that, but this is actually the original one on the left in Zout-Leeuw, which is about 18 meters high. It seems very small next to Trajan's column at the V&A, I must say, but it's quite high. And this is from the same workshop that made our sacramental tower, of which we now only have 4 caryatids left. Just moving along, I do want to show you some details of the Anne altarpiece, because it is quite extraordinary, even though it has been cleaned too much in the past with water holding cleaners, so it has lost a bit of its detail, but it is quite interesting, and I'm moving along a notch or a level each slide, because this altarpiece combines, although it's a Saint Anne altarpiece, it combines actually the life of the Virgin and the life of Christ. And it's then topped off with the two assumptions, I would say. Some more work by Roberto Nolo, who is the sculptor. And I do want to finish off with this, and then I'm going to leave you to ask questions if you want. Although this exhibition is mostly about sculpture, early modern sculpture, I would say sculpture from the 14th century to the 17th century, we did make two escapades onto contemporary art. And we chose to work with Sophie Muller, who is a Belgian artist, a Belgian sculptor. Well, she's actually more than a sculptor. She paints as well. She makes installations. But since 2015, she often works in alabaster as well. And she explores the human condition, the human psyche in her work. And she has this series of alabaster heads called Alabaster Mentalis, where she kind of shows the vulnerability of the human mind, the human mental state. And we have a few of these heads. You see two of them on the left in the exhibition. And then we asked her to make a new work for us, an answer to our St. Anne altarpiece. And this is what she made. She uses often the roughness of the alabaster lump, I would say. In Flemish we call them knollen, so the balls of alabaster. As alabaster does not come out of the ground like Carrara marble, where you can just ask your dimensions and they cut you a block. They are quite rough balls of alabaster. And Sophie uses that roughness in her work as well. And here she actually made her answer to the St. Anne altarpiece. She calls it a worldly St. Anne Trinitary, as she explores her relation between her mother and herself and her daughter. So like a trinity, a female trinity of her family, grandmother, mother and child, which is quite fitting. And we really like the way how she handled this, stepping away from the religious context and making it her own as well. So that's the Sophie Muller work I wanted to show you. I will conclude with making a little bit of shameless promotion for my publications, our publications, because we collaborated with all the leading scientists and researchers on alabaster for the book Alabaster Sculpture in Europe. And we have this little brochure in Dutch, I'm afraid, so for you it's not really interesting. As a synthesis. So I'm open to questions. Thank you for your attention.